Here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Aaron Mate. Our guests are Professor Timothy Mitchell of Columbia University, author of the book Carbon Democracy. Its subtitle, Political Power in the Age of Oil. James Marriott is with us. He co-wrote the book The Oil Road, Journeys from the Caspian Sea to the City of London. And Anna Galkina is also with us with the group, as is James' platform based in London. Aaron?
Yes, so Anna, I wanted to ask you, so the oil giant BP plays a huge role. They operate this pipeline. Can you talk about their history in Azerbaijan?
So BP first broke into Azerbaijan after the Soviet Union started falling apart. Some of the first contracts were signed in 1992, and the interesting thing is you'll find that BP were actually there before they've established their own relations with Azerbaijan before the Western governments actually did, and BP already had an office in Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan, before any of the Western governments had embassies. And for a while, in fact, they invited the British diplomats to come and share an office with them. And then what BP did, they recruited the British state to work on their behalf to help them break into this new territory and sign lucrative contracts. The president of Azerbaijan at the time, Elchibey, was, as we've found out from some documents that we got out of the British Foreign Office under Freedom of Information legislation, the president of Azerbaijan was a big fan of Margaret Thatcher. And so even though Mrs. Thatcher was no longer Prime Minister in the UK, the BP requested that she be brought over and help sign these contracts. So Margaret Thatcher got flown over from Hong Kong, where she was at the time on a trade visit as well. She got flown over from there to Baku and personally handed over the signature bonuses to the president and made sure that the contracts were signed. So this is part of a pattern that we see around the world where British as well as American and other Western governments act on behalf of their oil companies to break into new territories, to sign contracts that will sign away various different countries' oil for their profit.
I mean, BP, British Petroleum, has quite a sordid history. Didn't the U.S. And recent declassified CIA documents prove this? Overthrow the first democratically elected leader of Iran in 1953, Mossadegh, on behalf of BP, British Petroleum, as it was known then, or Anglo-American Oil, I think it was called then.
Absolutely, this is a really long history, but also we need to remember that now BP is more than just a British company. It is almost as much an American company as it is a British one, and in fact, more of BP's shares are listed on the American market than on the British one.
And James Marriott, you were just in New Orleans. We were all just there. And, of course, BP plays a key role in the recent history of New Orleans with the major oil spill 3 years ago.
That's right. That's right. I mean, of course, they're still held in the court of public opinion. They should be judged as to whether or not their responsibility for the spill has really been taken into account. I think our strong feeling would be that a judgment about the risk that was about the impact of whether or not the production was being done safely was made in the highest level of BP. We could discuss about the specific individuals such as Byron Grote or John Brown or Tony Hayward. They took a judgment, the CEO of BP up until 2005 and then CEO after that. And those folks took a specific judgment to cut costs as close to the bonus they possibly could to maximize profitability. It was a trend set in BP particularly strongly from 1995 onwards. And that cost-cutting made them take a risk, or encouraged them to take a risk, on just how close to the bone they could run the project, the drilling project in the Macondo field. And they took that calculated risk. And many calculated risks pay off, and this one didn't, tragically, for the people on the production platform and for the communities along the Gulf Coast and the ecology of the Gulf. But they took a calculated risk, and our strong feeling is that they should be held to account personally for the fact that they personally took this risk, and they personally took an action which resulted in this tragedy. And that is not what is happening now in the court case in New Orleans. The company itself is being held to account, but not the individuals who took this personal action.
What do you mean personal risk?
Well, I mean this, which is that say I need to get from to downtown to the shops fast, and I'm in a hurry, and I make a judgment as to whether or not I'm going to drive at high speed beyond the speed limit to go through a low speed limit area, and I drive my car that way, and I hit a kid, and the kid is killed. I took a risk, I took a judgment, like to be able to get there quickly, and I wouldn't run over a child. Of course, I didn't want to run over a child, but when I did run over that child, then my risk didn't work out. Now, if that happens, I go to court, and if I'm found guilty, I go to prison. The car company doesn't go to court and doesn't go to prison. They took a judgment about how they should operate in this instance. They cut it close to the bone, they took a risk, the risk didn't pay off, and they should be held to account.
Let's turn to President Obama speaking recently at the UN General Assembly. During the speech, Obama told the world the U.S. is prepared to use its military to defend what he termed our core interests in the Middle East, that is, U.S. access to oil.
The United States of America is prepared to use all elements of our power, including military force, to secure our core interests in the region. We will confront external aggression against our allies and partners, as we did in the Gulf War. We will ensure the free flow of energy from the region to the world.
That's President Obama saying that the U.S. is prepared to use military force to defend U.S. access to oil in the Middle East. Let's turn to Timothy Mitchell, author of Carbon Democracy. Professor Mitchell, in your book, you argue that we can't understand the modern democratic state without comprehending the centrality of oil. Can you explain your thesis for us?
Yes, there's often thought to be a negative relationship between oil and democracy. If you have a lot of oil, if you're a state that produces a lot of oil, you seem to be undemocratic. What I try to show in the book is there's a much longer and more interesting history of this relationship between oil and democracy, and that it involves us as much as the countries that depend on the production of oil. And the way to think about that is to go back to the history of coal. Without coal, we would not have the particular forms of mass democracy that emerged in the early 20th century, because with coal, it became possible for groups of organized workers for the first time in history to shut down an economy. The dependence on a single source of energy created vulnerability that organized forces in coal production, in the transportation of coal, could take advantage of. Oil was different. It didn't give workers the same kind of opportunity to threaten a productive system, and therefore it proved much more difficult to democratize on the basis of oil. Difficult for the countries that produced the oil, but also difficult for the countries, therefore, that began to switch from coal to oil, realizing that you could actually de-democratize a democratic country if you became more dependent on oil.
So the U.S. decision to reorient the world toward oil production after World War II, that's a response to trying to counter coal unions in Europe?
There were many reasons for the turn from coal to oil, including just the much greater use of oil for transportation. But among the things going into the calculation, this was at the level of U.S. funding and the rebuilding of Europe after World War II, is that we have to defeat the left in Europe. The left is particularly strong in the coal industry, and the way to weaken the kinds of calls for broader-based democracy that are beginning to take place in Europe is actually to undermine them by beginning to replace the basic energy infrastructure of Europe moving from coal to oil. In other words, to bring oil from the Middle East, so that, as it were, the deindustrialization, the moving of production abroad that we think of as something that happened in the 70s and 80s actually began in a certain way in the 40s and 50s with the removing of energy production from Europe to the Middle East, with the kinds of de-democratizing potential for that in Europe, as well as for those involved in oil production there.
In Carbon Democracy, you have a very interesting chapter called McJihad. Explain it, and especially this week on the 12th anniversary of the occupation of Afghanistan.
Yes, I wrote McJihad initially in response to the U.S. Invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, because that was the time, of course, when the U.S. declared this crusade against forms of militant and jihadist Islam. And it was a time when people began talking about a clash of civilizations, about the West standing for enlightenment and reason and opposing itself to the forms of unreason and illiberal politics represented by something that was called jihad, Islamic radicalism of various forms. There's a very different history of the relationship between the U.S. and a variety of forms of political Islam. And one of the main parts of that relationship has been a strong alliance between the United States and conservative Islamic forces, such as those that are in power in Saudi Arabia and other parts of the Gulf. And I think one has to understand the reason the U.S. came to depend on anti-democratic forces to maintain the kinds of interests and positions it had in the region, to make more sense of the rise of radical Islamic forces in the more recent period. Can you talk about the meeting of the Taliban in the United States? Yes. Before the attacks of 9/11, when the Taliban had first come to power in Afghanistan in the previous decade, the U.S. was very interested in the possibility of working with them. At that time, they were interested in the possibility of negotiating routes for pipelines. We were talking about earlier the pipelines from the Caspian, the Central Asian region, and interested in that. And they saw the Taliban as someone they could work with. In fact, they made the explicit reference in the State Department meetings when the Taliban visited Washington, met with Ronald Reagan. They came to Texas. They came to Texas and met with the Bushes. Met with the Bushes there and talked about the Taliban as being just like the Saudis. I mean, these are the kind of people we can work with because we need people who are conservative, who believe in a strict application of Islamic law. This will create the kind of state we would be interested in.
So do you think that the Afghan war was linked somehow to trying to secure access to these pipelines?
Not directly. The other things happened in between. Of course, there was a longer history before that of the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan and the funding of the Mujahideen, the variety of Islamic groups, prior to the rise of the Taliban, in order to try and bring down a government that it felt was too friendly to the Soviet Union and to try and embroil the Soviet Union in conflict in the region, which it successfully did. In those days, it's U.S. policy. Didn't Zbigniew Brzezinski famously say exactly, we want to embroil the Soviets in their own Vietnam? And when asked what about supporting the Mujahideen, he said, what's a few riled-up Muslims? Exactly. And that was the policy in those days. And then even today, of course, we see in a variety of places around the world, the U.S. is very happy working with conservative Islamic forces where they can come to power at the expense of more progressive groups that might threaten the kinds of interests the U.S. has in the region. Professor Mitchell, can you talk about Egypt? I mean, today, front-page headlines once again, the scores of Egyptians being killed in this face-off between the ousted Muslim Brotherhood and the military regime that's in power today. You've written books about it. You're an expert on Egypt. What's happening there now? Well, it's a very sad situation at the moment. As you know, there was a revolution almost 3 years ago that finally brought down the American-supported dictatorship of Hosni Mubarak that had been in power for decades. And in the aftermath of that revolution, a government came to power headed by the Muslim Brotherhood. The Brotherhood was enormously unpopular after a year in office, and there was very widespread protests against the government. At that point, the military stepped in, carried out a coup, removed it from power. Very many of those involved in organizing the protests were very unhappy subsequently at the extraordinary violence with which the armed forces have not only rounded up, imprisoned, but also killed many, many hundreds of protesters, of the supporters of the ousted government. The armed forces seem to think that they can return not just to the old system of ruling the government through force and through repression, but to do so on a scale that simply wasn't seen in the days of the Mubarak regime.
Well, as we talk about Egypt and pipelines, let's turn to part of a video produced by activists who fought against BP's attempts to build a gas terminal in the Egyptian community of Idku. In this clip, a resident describes what happened when they went to a government office to protest the officials' negotiations with BP.
When we learned there was a company that would build a factory in our area, we went to talk to the responsible government bodies. We had only one question. What is this factory supposed to be? Does it threaten to cause any harm or not? When we first took to the main highway, still far from the road and the factory site, we were surprised by an astonishing security presence, firing live ammunition against us, and attacks from plainclothes informants and police. Our people were arrested. The more we asked around, we realized the corporation had political cover and security cover from the police forces.
Anna, the story of BP in Egypt and what happened with this remarkable defeat organized by local residents in this community.
So BP wanted to build a gas plant to process the gas that they're going to extract offshore, just off the coast there in Egypt. And the community in Idku had already experienced environmental devastation connected to fossil fuels, because the company BG had already had a presence. And so the community in Idku understood that they weren't going to get all these wonderful promises that BP came in with, and they realized that they didn't want another gas plant on their doorstep. And so what they did was they went and occupied the space where BP was going to construct. They showed up at government offices, like we just heard. They broke into offices. They protested. They wrote to various officials and so on. And by doing this, they stalled construction for 6 months, for a year and a half. Eventually, BP realized that they weren't going to be able to construct there. They weren't going to be able to make money by constructing their plant there. And so what we've seen since then is, of course, BP are going to try and just move on along the coast a few miles and try and build their plant in another village. And what's been really inspiring for us was to see that the villagers in Idku have now jumped in their trucks and went along the coast to the next village to share their experience and to share how they can organize against this happening.
And how does that play into overall Egypt politics and U.S. in relation? You know, there's this joke going around, Professor Mitchell, which is a very sad joke about Iraq, and a little boy saying to his father, "What's our oil doing under their sand?" But can you talk about the U.S. in relation to Egypt as well as Iraq and other countries?
Well, in general, the revolutionary period over the last 2-3 years in Egypt has seen a remarkable development in terms of the kinds of community organizing that Anna was just talking about, at the level of workplaces, at the level of villages and towns, people beginning to protest and demand improvements to quality of life, to working conditions, to terms of employment, waves of strikes that are actually a strike movement that goes back to before the revolution, and that was one of the most powerful aspects of the wave of democratic action in the country over the last several years. The new military government in power is shutting down strikes, even though a quite progressive member of the labor movement was put in charge of labor policy by the government. He immediately declared a moratorium on strikes. The U.S. doesn't actually know particularly what to do about the situation in general. It thought it had a nice compromise with the Muslim Brotherhood in power, the kind of conservative regime that indeed did not pass any progressive labor laws, refused to do so, even though they'd been a major demand of the revolution. And the U.S. was happy with that and was rather uncertain about the moves the military has taken, which don't seem to be producing any new kind of political order, but in fact sort of leading to deterioration that if it continues the way it is, will mean Egypt is in the situation that Syria is in, with the armed forces of the state turning to uncontrolled violence against its political opponents.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion. Our guests are Columbia University professor Timothy Mitchell. His book is called Carbon Democracy. James Marriott is co-author of The Oil Road, and Anna Galkina is with the group, as is James' platform in London. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in a minute.